Hi friends, in this video we will briefly introduce the idea of biodiversity and talk about why it is so important to ecosystems around the world. So what do we mean when we say biodiversity? It might be a good idea to take a moment here and try to break down this word. So we see this word bio and then we see the word diversity. So bio means life, diversity means again, to be diverse, so to have lots of different things, different parts, etc. So biodiversity really just means that. So biodiversity is how we describe the variety or the amount of different living things within a given ecosystem. So when we say that an ecosystem has greater or more biodiversity, this means that that ecosystem has lots of different types of plant and animal species present. Biodiversity is very important to the health and stability of ecosystems. So, ecosystems with that greater biodiversity, lots of different species, lots of different organisms present, are healthier ecosystems overall. Let's look at an example. I'm sure you guys have heard of a coral reef. If you've ever gone scuba diving or maybe you've seen it on a movie, we know that within a coral reef, there are hundreds, sometimes even thousands of different species there of both corals, marine plants, fish, invertebrate, thousands of different species. An extremely great example of high and thriving biodiversity. Lots and lots of different forms of life living on that reef. An example of an ecosystem where we don't see very much biodiversity would be Antarctica. So Antarctica, as we know, is in the Arctic, very, very cold, very extreme temperatures that are only appropriate for a very small amount of organisms. For that reason, if we were to look at the ecosystem in Antarctica, there really are only a handful of species, showing much less biodiversity within that ecosystem. So now that we know what biodiversity is, why is it so important to ecosystems, as we just mentioned? So when scientists or ecologists look at an ecosystem, biodiversity is one way to get an indication of how well or how healthy that ecosystem currently is. Again, we said that more biodiversity indicates that the ecosystem is doing very well, it's very healthy, whereas less might indicate that something is going on. So why is that? So ecosystems with greater biodiversity are healthier and they're more stable. So what do we mean by stable? That means that it's less likely to change. This means that ecosystems with higher or greater biodiversity are less susceptible or are less vulnerable to changes that take place in the ecosystem. When there's lots of different species present, lots of different life, small changes are not as severe to the ecosystem. The other reason that biodiversity is important is because every organism in an ecosystem, from the largest apex predator all the way down to the fungus or the bacteria, play a vital role within that ecosystem, ranging from the production of oxygen by the plants, population control by predators, providing food and other resources for other organisms. This means that the loss of a single organism within an ecosystem can have a profound effect. Let's look at a quick example of one of these happening within an ecosystem. So as we can see here, this might be a forest or, a prairie out in the Midwest somewhere. And we can see on our food web that we have this one little plant or berry tree, perhaps, at the bottom of the food web as the producer. We also can see that that's our only producer. So maybe not the greatest example of biodiversity taking place here. So let's think of an example. Maybe a drought came or a special fungus that this plant was susceptible passed through this forest, wiping out the population of this plant. We can see that as this is on the web, the only producer, the only source of food for the whole ecosystem, this would be absolutely devastating to the whole ecosystem. And if this plant were truly wiped out and there were truly no other plant species present to fill in as the food source, this entire ecosystem would actually die out. So we can see that with not that large amount of diversity, multiple different species present, our ecosystem here was very, very susceptible to just that one change. Now let's look at one different example. So here we can see another forest, a little bit different, but some similar species happening. But we can see some differences here. So let's think about the same example. So acorns come from a certain type of tree. We'll just say an acorn tree for now. So let's say the same thing takes place. A special fungus that only acorn trees are susceptible to passes through the forest and decimates or wipes out the full population of that acorn tree. Now, this would be problematic. This would be an issue. We're losing an entire food source for several different species, which we know is going to impact the ecosystem. However, we can also see that this rabbit, this grasshopper, and this mouse also have another food source in the grass that they can lean on or that they can eat in the case that the acorns are no longer present. Now, there would be effects to this ecosystem. We are losing an entire resource in the acorns. However, though their populations might decrease, this ecosystem would definitely be able to bounce back from this. So here we can see it's a quick example of how biodiversity comes into play in the stability and the health of an ecosystem. Now let's talk about native biodiversity. So we know what biodiversity is. What do we think of when we hear the word native? What is something that's native? Okay, so native biodiversity is speaking to organisms which are native to or naturally occur within a given ecosystem. This means that those organisms belong there. They were not brought there by humans. That is their natural native ecosystem. Now, native biodiversity is what we want to see because when there is non-native biodiversity, it can lead to problems. We can see something taking place called invasive species. So what we mean by invasive species are species or organisms which are not native to that ecosystem, but instead have been introduced by other means. Oftentimes, these means are human. So perhaps humans took those animals as a pet. Perhaps they brought one of those plants over because they thought it might be a good crop. And eventually, because it doesn't belong in that ecosystem, can lead to severe problems. Invasive species can begin to take over and wreak some serious havoc and cause serious negative impacts on the ecosystem that they're introduced to. An example of this is the lionfish. Lionfish are beautiful. They're amazing to look at. They're very, very cool fish. However, they are a very, very, very big problem in a lot of waterways around the world because they have been introduced to ecosystems in which they are not native, in which they do not belong, and have begun to cause some serious, serious problems to the fish in those ecosystems. So let's look at this example. So lionfish are predatory fish. They are carnivorous, they are very large, they are very aggressive predators. And when they are introduced into these ecosystems where they don't belong, couple of things happen. Number one, you can see on the food web that they are taking up a whole lot of the food source. So because they are such aggressive predators and so carnivorous, they oftentimes will take a lot of the resources and the food availability from other species. So eating up all of the other fish's food leads to severe problems in the populations of those fishes. Another issue is that lionfish have no natural predator because they do not belong in that ecosystem. There is no predator there to naturally control their population, but it leads to the population of that invasive species absolutely skyrocketing and ballooning to the point where it's literally taking over the entire ecosystem. So maintaining biodiversity is important, but maintaining native biodiversity is also extremely important because non-native biodiversity can have serious negative impacts within the ecosystem.